Antarctica, a continent larger than Australia, frozen at the bottom of the world. Many Australians are unaware that we claim almost half of the white continent as our sovereign territory. But why do we claim so much of Antarctica, and what are we doing down there? Time for a special investigation into Australia's involvement in Antarctica. Australia's affairs in Antarctica are managed through the Australian Antarctic Division, headquartered in Kingston, just south of Hobart. Nick Gales is the director of the AAD and is well aware of Australia's proud Antarctic history.
So Australia's got a long history in Antarctica. We were one of the countries involved during the Great Heroic Era, and even back then the early Australian and other explorers recognised the importance of Antarctica. They recognised that, especially from Australia, the weather generated in Antarctica was the same systems affected Australia and the region. And really since then, Australia has had that long continued interest in trying to understand Antarctica and to protect this extraordinary area under what has now emerged over the last number of decades as a fairly unique international treaty.
Gillian Slocum is the Manager for Territories, Environment and Treaties at the Australian Antarctic Division.
Australia has an external territory in Antarctica, the Australian Antarctic Territory, which makes up 42% of the Antarctic continent. So it's a very large and very important part of Australia for Australians.
Over at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies at the University of Tasmania, Tony Press is an adjunct professor at the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems Cooperative Research Centre.
Australia asserts sovereignty to the Australian Antarctic Territory. It was transferred to Australia in 1933 by the British. Australia proclaimed it in 1936. And when the Antarctic Treaty was negotiated, the status of that claim to Antarctica was protected by Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty.
So the Antarctic Treaty it's quite an incredible treaty in that it was actually negotiated during the Cold War era. And some of the fundamental principles of the Antarctic Treaty are that the Antarctic won't be militarised and that it'll be for peaceful purposes and for scientific research, and that there'll be a free exchange of scientific information that people collect in Antarctica.
What it means is that our claim to the Australian Antarctic Territory is not diminished by the international agreement that covers all of Antarctica. Australia asserts its sovereignty and operates in Antarctica as if the Australian Antarctic Territory was its sovereign territory, but the Antarctic Treaty provides all treaty parties with rights and obligations to the whole of Antarctica.
There's only 4 other nations that recognise our sovereignty over that area. It means something to us, and it's important to make sure that we're always considering our sovereignty and making sure that we protect our sovereignty now and into the future.
And it's pleasing to know that everything that we do in Antarctica is in the name of science.
Science is the currency of influence in the Antarctic Treaty System. Science is very important. And if you want to be an important player in Antarctica, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have a very good, rational, productive science program.
Pretty much all of our activities are centred around doing science. So it's around the understanding of Antarctica. It's the activities, it's almost a cliche, it's the language of collaboration in Antarctica is science.
Our activities in Antarctica are all coordinated by a plan.
Last year, the Australian government released the Australian Antarctic Strategy and the 20-year action plan, and for the first time that strategy clearly articulates what Australia's national interests in Antarctica are and the ways in which we will deliver on those national interests into the future.
I think the government responded very well in its 2016 strategy and action plan for Australia's operations in Antarctica. That needs to be definitely followed up with the the money to implement all of the very good things that are in that.
So what kinds of science do we do in Antarctica?
So the science ranges across a broad range of areas. In the past, it was driven really, as many science areas are, by the curiosity of the people who were employed to undertake the program. But it has really focused now on areas of agreed priority. And so broadly, those go into areas of climate science, understanding the role of high latitude climate science and how that drives global regional climate systems. And then the other big chunk of our science is really around, if you want to call it sort of conservation science or sustainability science.
And all of these activities have to conform to the Madrid Protocol.
The Madrid Protocol, it's an extraordinary convention that came in right at the time when there were international agreements coming in that were trying to set up a framework to allow for mining in Antarctica. So discussions were well advanced. A draft convention had been pulled together to attempt to manage the mining.
And Australia and France decided that actually this wasn't the way that we wanted to go, that we should be protecting the Antarctic environment. And so they came to one of the final stages of the negotiations with a complete turnaround and suggesting and proposing that countries agree to have an explicit and enduring prohibition on mining in Antarctica and to do everything that we could do to protect the Antarctic environment.
But why is it so important to conduct climate research in such a remote and frozen place like Antarctica?
High latitude climate science, and I think Antarctic climate science in particular, is fundamentally important in understanding what is to come. Nearly all of the world's fresh water is locked up in the Antarctic ice cap. The Southern Ocean drives through each of the major ocean systems in such a way that any changes in the Southern Ocean will have reaches right up into the Northern Hemisphere through the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean systems. It's really important to understand how those elements are interacting, what's happening to the ice shelves and the ice sheet, and what that means for our future, well, in that case on sea level rise, for issues directly with weather systems and climate, as well as, of course, ocean acidification. So it's fundamentally important that we are doing a lot of the work that goes to what's happening in Antarctica in a changing climate and how is that going to affect our models that predict our future.
The Antarctic Treaties Committee on Environmental Protection has a climate change response work program that they are currently implementing, and Australia and Norway are currently working in CAMLR, which is the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, to have a similar climate change response program so that we can take into account the impacts of climate change on Antarctica when we're making decisions about Antarctica.
Ice cores, which collect the signatures of those weather systems down south over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, contain that record.
Ice cores collected from Antarctica are brought back to Hobart for examination, as Ice Core Group Leader Mark Curran explains.
Ice cores are very important. They record the history of our climate. In Antarctica, where the ice is frozen, as the snow falls, it's frozen in through time, and we can then go back and recover that snow as we drill an ice core. When we get the ice cores back to Hobart, we process them in the laboratories. We measure various chemicals on them, including sodium, chloride, sulfate. This gives us information on aerosols, on volcanic activity, on wind speeds. We also measure stable isotopes, which gives us information on temperature. So our ice age cycles over the last million years or so have been around 100,000 years. Before then, they were 40,000 years, and we don't understand why. Ice cores provide information on temperature and carbon dioxide, and this information will help us understand why these ice age cycles change, and will help us to understand the links between temperature and carbon dioxide, which is obviously important for our current climate change.
Such a vast and untouched source of resources requires a careful management, particularly when there are pressures to exploit some of those resources.
Well, I think the first resource pressure, the one that will manifest itself before anything else, are marine living resources, fisheries, krill, fishing, things like that. What's really important about thinking about that is that the precautionary approach that the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources uses to establish catch limits and to manage the whole of the marine ecosystem in Antarctica has a very strong conservation approach. And that means that those resources in Antarctica will be maintained far longer than resources in the rest of the world.
So in the past, there's been a very high level of illegal fishing, illegal unreported fishing operated in Antarctica for high-value finfish. In this case, the toothfish, the Patagonian and the Antarctic toothfish. These are really high-value fish, and there was a very large effort made to go down and exploit that beyond the very carefully regulated fishes down there. That has really been reduced through international cooperation, driven through CAMLR, through agreements where catches are traced, the vessels are monitored, there's observers on vessels, very high level of compliance, and then countries have worked together to really reduce illegal fishing in Antarctica to a low level. There's a growing fishery for Antarctic krill.
And none better to show me around the Antarctic Division's krill labs than Krill Master Rob King.
What you're looking at here beside me are 2 tanks of krill. These are adults and these are juveniles. These juveniles here, although they look quite dense in the tank, are actually quite thin compared to what we find in the field. In the Southern Ocean you can have 60 kilograms of krill, that's 60,000 adults in 1 cubic metre. And that's why whales will swim all the way down the coast of Australia, all the way to Antarctica to feed, because the prize at the end is just so enormous. There's so much food available in these schools of krill. These boxes have these controllers in that very precisely control the amount of carbon dioxide flow, mix it with ambient air, and take the concentration of carbon dioxide up to the various levels that we're expecting over the next 100 to 200 or 300 years. And what we've seen by doing this is that if we allow carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere to just increase as they are now, a business as usual emission scenario, by the end of this century, only half the krill eggs in the Southern Ocean that hatch today should continue to hatch. And in 300 years, by the year 2300, we should find that there's only about 2% of the krill eggs hatching in the Southern Ocean, which would be, a recipe for very huge, profound ecosystem change.
Another emerging pressure in Antarctica is the ever-growing number of tourists who want to go there.
Tourism has been a massive growth industry in Antarctica over the last decade in particular, particularly around the Antarctic Peninsula. It rose from a fairly stable 10,000 or so people a year who were heading south to now getting numbers up around 40,000.
All activities in Antarctica have to be subject to an environmental impact assessment, and that includes tourism activities. Each country is responsible for the actions of their nationals. So Australia, and here at the Australian Antarctic Division, we're responsible for regulating the activities of Australians in Antarctica. So if there's an Australian tourist operator operating on the peninsula or in East Antarctica, they come to us and they submit an EIA, which we assess, and we provide them with an environmental authorisation.
It's a very positive thing that people around the world can go south and see Antarctica. It would be sad for the continent to be locked up.
One of the first drivers for people to go to Antarctica was the abundance of whales. Today, whaling activity has dropped right off, but there are still those who wish to hunt whales in Antarctic waters.
So there's a relationship that happens between the Antarctic Treaty and also the CAMLR Convention and the International Whaling Convention. And both the Antarctic Treaty and the CAMLR Convention say that the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling is responsible for regulating whaling. So it's something that we don't deal with in the Antarctic Treaty forums, but we leave to the RWC to handle.
Japan is the only country that takes whales in the Southern Ocean. It does so under an article of the convention that they claim allows them to take whales for the purposes of scientific research. So it's a contentious area. Australia absolutely believes, not only have we said, but we've demonstrated clearly that non-lethal techniques in whale research are not only applicable here, but they are more powerful. Much more information can be gained from the current tools than can possibly be gained from killing whales.
So what can't we do in Antarctica?
We can't mine in Antarctica. The Madrid Protocol actually bans mining in Antarctica indefinitely.
So there's a common misconception that the Madrid Protocol comes up for review in 2048, and that's actually not correct. The ban on mining is indefinite. At 2048, there are reviews that could be invoked, but the safeguards in place to protect the Madrid Protocol and everything that it stands for are such that many countries, including Australia, would need to agree to any changes to the Madrid Protocol for them to come into force.
A number of years ago, in the mid-2000s, it was estimated that to have economically viable petroleum exploration in Antarctica, the price of oil would have to be somewhere around about $170 a barrel, and that was in 2004 dollars. So we're not likely to hit that point in the very near future, so not even in the next few decades.
How will the Antarctic Treaty System deal with challenges in the future, like the ever-present desire to mine there?
I think the treaty's well positioned to deal with difficult tensions that emerge. I guess I respect ultimately the ability of countries to slowly and carefully consider these things and change where necessary, and where there are major, clear ethical issues at stake that can be dealt with well within the treaty.
Right now we're in a position where all countries that are active in Antarctica are members or parties to the Antarctic Treaty. So we have that safeguard there.
With the Antarctic Treaty in place, how well is Australia's claim to Antarctica protected into the future?
It's not just our claim in Antarctica that's important. It's the framework of what the treaty delivers that's equally important, and that is the demilitarisation, the dedication of the entire continent to peace and science is of incredible importance to Australia and I'd argue to the world.
I can assure you that the future of the environment in Antarctica is protected through the Madrid Protocol. There is an indefinite ban on mining, and the safeguards in place are such that the environment will continue to be protected into the future.
And so, to that future, will it be business as usual for Australia in Antarctica?
I hope it's better than business as usual. I hope that Australia becomes a more significant player in Antarctic science and Antarctic diplomacy. Now, that science is also really important for the rest of the world. The oceanography that we do in the Antarctic through the Australian Antarctic Program is telling us how the whole planet is going to respond to climate change. The same with the glaciology. So it's important for Australia to be a core and key player in this because it's in our national interest.